Hello, my name's Mark Ritson. How are you? I'm a former marketing professor of 25 years standing. I'm now, I wouldn't like to say a man of leisure, but I am now a private marketing consultant and I run my own online programs in various different places. And I've been asked by Google to talk to you about the long and the short of financial services marketing. Something I'm delighted to talk about because it interests me greatly, and I've spent a significant part of my consulting career working with financial services clients, all the way back to Peter Stringham at HSBC. So it's a great topic, and I'm going to spend about an hour exploring it. Before I get onto the content, though, a couple of key points. Google, unfortunately for me, but fortunately for you, aren't paying me to do this. Which is I actually think is a good thing. I'm interested in this kind of stuff, and I regard being able to talk to you guys in this session and then in our interactive session that follows just a really interesting opportunity. So I'm not being paid, so that's a key point, I think. And the second thing is, to Google's credit, they haven't interfered with any of my content. They haven't asked me to talk specifically about a particular chart or data point. They've also not asked for anything in my draft deck to be removed, which I also think is to their credit. And then finally, I'm going to use quite a lot of data from a number of sources, but three main research firms: Ubiquity, Analytic Partners, and Nielsen. And I think you could not ask for three more objective organizations. All of them, I think, are trustworthy companies. And I say that not because anyone's lying to you, but I could probably line up the next 6 slides proving to you that any channel you like is more effective than the next channel using industry data. I don't think that's useful. But I do think these companies have proven themselves to be genuine. And that's important because we're going to talk a little bit about the gaps in TV and also the value of digital video. I think it's important to use companies like Ubiquity, who've defended TV, but are also objective about some of the areas where there's weakness as well. So I'll rely on that data, nothing actually from Google themselves, in the presentation too. All right, so when I work on brands or train brand managers, I have a very simple point of view. And that point of view is that you do marketing, and specifically brand management, in kind of 3 sequential phases. First, you need to do your diagnosis to work out what's going on. Then you need to develop a strategy and answer the core strategic questions. And then finally, having developed that very clear, crisp brand strategy, we move on to the actual tactical execution. And I believe these 3 are equally important, and they should be done in sequence. And so I've applied that to this session now, in the sense that what I'd like to talk to you about roughly follows these 3 themes. So I want to start by talking briefly about what I believe is the ideal diagnosis for good financial services brand management, and look specifically at 2 key inputs. Then we'll move to strategy, look at the effectiveness drivers, what makes marketing and advertising and branding more or less effective, and no surprise given the title, zoom in on the long and the short of it, and where it does and doesn't work within financial services. Finally, we'll move to tactics, and specifically the interesting story right now of video in the broadest sense, which I'll talk to you about at the end of the session. Okay, that's my plan. And then, not to forget, we do have this interactive time that will follow this non-interactive session. I'll try and make it as interactive as I can, where we can then discuss things. And I would encourage you, as you look at this particular prezzo, to think about anything you want to talk or challenge or discuss when we get a chance to chat later on, because it's up for discussion, and I can learn as much as you from this, genuinely. So this is my point of view, but I'd look forward to a discussion. All right. Let's start with the diagnosis part and this idea of what makes for an ideal approach to understanding financial services brands. I only think there's 2 things you really need. And forgive my simplicity. I'm aware of the size and heft of most of the financial services brands in Australia, but I think they overcook the cake significantly. So First of all, you have to have a funnel. I know there's a trendy debate about how funnels don't work anymore and what's wrong with a buying path and all that nonsense. I find that to be a redundant conversation. I think a great funnel is more important than ever. I think it's the backbone of any decent financial services marketing. But there are a couple of things to look out for that I think signify funnel expertise when it comes to financial services. The first one is customization. I think I'm still surprised when I see work being done by big brands everywhere. They're still using a textbook funnel. That's totally not the right thing to do. You are allowed, indeed encouraged, to customize the steps in the funnel to your particular business. You know, it's great having unaided, aided awareness, consideration, preference, etc. And probably there'll be some flavor of that in there, but you should absolutely be encouraged to customize it to fit the quite peculiar nature of financial services. That's the first point. Obviously, and I think most brands get this, you also have different funnels per different segment. Occasionally that means actually different stages, but always it means different conversion numbers across those common stages. And if you have 7 or 8 key target segments, you should very much have 7 or 8 very distinct funnels to generate objectives from. For me, the acid test of any company that knows their funnel game is that they aren't messing around with awareness, particularly in financial services, where I know we can measure aided and unaided and top of mind, but all of them are relatively weak measures, as you'll see, and discovering that we have 90% aided awareness is, I would argue, not that interesting, and no one does anything with it. So I do think when you see a brand that's moved from awareness to salience, I do think you see a best-in-class player and one that is doing a little bit more thinking. And so what that means is salience reigns supreme. I'm always sad that that's the case, because it means Ehrenberg Bass were right again, but they were. Salience is the more appropriate measure. It's not as big a step from unaided awareness to salience as Ehrenberg Bass sometimes would have you believe. But there is a difference, and a significant difference. And the two I would highlight, and you will probably know this, are, first of all, we're not queuing the customer with the category. When you queue them with banks or insurance companies, you know, it's a completely alien queue to the situation. So queuing them with you know, changing state or upgrading house and so forth is a far more interesting and important and applied metric. And it does make a difference, a big difference, as it turns out, to how the numbers look and how useful they are. And second, salience fades. You know, these awareness scores really are pretty constant, scarily so. Whereas salience for certain category entry points really does fade in and out depending on activity, which I think is also an important point. Why is salience so important and so of the moment? You have to turn to the work of Kahneman. I know it's a cliche, but it's true. And his metaphor of System 1 and System 2, which is so important in marketing, even though many challenge it. So, as you again almost certainly know, Kahneman posits that there are 2 different ways in which the brain is making decisions. System 1, fast, automatic, error-prone, lazy, and unconscious for the most part. And my favourite example of that is, you know, you walk into a coffee shop post-lockdown to get your morning coffee, and the barista says, do you want a flat white or do you want a cappuccino? And you go, flat white. You have no idea how or why you want a flat white or where that decision came from, but it was definitely there. That's System 1. And then, of course, System 2 that we're all more familiar with, slow, more conscious, more effortful, more explicit to the brain. You're aware that you're doing it, yeah? And the point is that in so many businesses, financial services being only one of them, I've looked a lot at B2B where System 1 also dominates. What we're doing is we're taking System 1 decisions and applying a System 2 lens in the form of qual and quant research that reveals a whole host of stuff that really isn't there. If I do a focus group or if I do a survey on coffee and your choice of coffee, I can find System 2 reasons, but they probably weren't the reasons why that particular decision was made. Salience, coming to mind in buying situations, looking like yourself, being there is the game. And it's not a million miles from awareness, but it's a different thing from when you think about banks, which banks do you think of? You know what I mean? And I think that's important. And in financial services, I think there are three main reasons it's particularly important. Oh, and what I would say to you is, you know, we need to de-emphasize the System 2 stuff and get more on top of System 1 in financial services specifically. Why is that? First, because it's an area of traditional neglect. We're sleeping on brand awareness data and not looking at that more appropriate and probably more scary salience data. Second, I think one of the things that no one has yet, maybe you have, but I don't see many people thinking about, is we're obviously moving to a different era. We're obviously, all of us, I think, as far as I know, closing a lot of branches. And that makes a lot of financial sense. But the one thing I don't think anyone's factored into it yet is the impact on salience of losing, literally on every street, a massive part of brand salience in the form of windows, signage, and just presence, yeah? So it'll hurt a bank's salience, I think, deeply over the coming years. And finally, the arrival of our friends in the world of digital, perhaps even Google, but certainly Apple. I think salience is a declining thing for banks. I can speak to my own experience. I'm an ANZ customer. I always have been. I'm a promoter, I would say. Yeah, don't hate me. I've got very good friends at Westpac. Don't hate me. But the point is, as much as I do like ANZ, I haven't really thought about them for about, I would say, 2 years. Certainly the last 12 months, because I'm using a new and not unexpected device to do all of my financial transactions, including, and that's not just the story of a digital person, right? Including getting out my credit card to pay for things, which I have not done literally in a year, yeah? So that's important because Apple is the brand now, not ANZ. I really don't think about it. And that, again, impact on salience is something we should be aware of and we should be measuring. All right, so salience reigns supreme here. And I would say also a little other twist of this is working out actual consideration. Actual in the sense that, again, in these questionnaires we can ask, you know, would you consider ING? Sure, I'd consider them. But the reality is, no, I won't, because I can't be bothered. I'm not in the market for mortgages or anything else. And if I'm going to do anything, I'll do it with my existing bank. And I worked this out once. If I live to be 80, by the way, this is the actual AI image of me aged 80. It's going to be good, right? I've only got, this is 30 years from now, right? I'm 50 in a couple of weeks. Look at that. Anyway, if I live to be 80, in my adult life, I reckon there were 10 days across that whole 62-year period when I was an adult where I really was in the market for considering any alternative to my current bank. And so my point is, again, either through targeting or through an additional addendum to the funnel, we have to remove the idea that we have 65% consideration, because we don't. It's of a much tinier group. And what's interesting to me in particular is, if you look at the idea of measuring salience properly through category entry points and this idea of actual consideration, they both come from very much the same place, which is what would cue you to consider to stay with or change or switch or open a new product. The roots to those things are both in the same place. So you see the interest there in getting funnels done properly. I would always have NPS as my post-purchase stage. I believe in NPS. I don't think it correlates to future business growth, and the big four banks would be proof of that. I do think it's a C-suite variable, and it's something that beautifully measures satisfaction in a simple way. And the qual and quant measures are fantastically useful. But my point would be, I'd have it here in a different way. I'd have it post-purchase as the promoter portion of the NPS, the 9s or 10s, as a nice metric that I can reuse in my funnel. And MFI, why not? I think it's a useful variable, very different from NPS, however. And then we get into the nitty-gritty of it. Again, I see a lot of funnels. I'm not sure how many of those funnels are being squeezed hard enough. For example, there's no point looking at funnel data unless you look at the conversions versus your competitors. And as we know, the competitors change across the different segments. And with a little sleight of hand, it's possible to get a really good sense of what the drivers of conversion are from one step to another. At the most advanced level, I love what I call bridging variables. I think it's the most elegant analysis I've seen and the one that makes companies the most money. And what I mean by bridging variables is when you've done your funnel work, let's say that blue stage is, active consideration and the green stage is preference, okay? Let's say you find that there are 50% of the market would actively consider you, but when you run the numbers on preference, only 20% prefer you. So 1 out of the 5. The best data I have seen across any industry, and it would work beautifully for financial services, is to drill into the small minority that go from consideration to preference and compare them to the larger majority who stay in consideration and don't move to preference. Let the data tell you what is the bridge from one step to the other, because some customers cross that bridge. Is it demographic? Is it attitudinal? Is it behavioral? The data can tell us, and tell us relatively swiftly in my experience. And I think it's a brilliant place to do proper data mining. Now, linked to a decent bit of funnel is simple but advanced brand tracking. I have to be honest with you. I despair on the quality of brand tracking generally in the world, and financial services is no different. The amount of money spent bears no correlation with the quality of the insights produced. And I think financial services would be a classic area to illustrate that point. So what do I mean? Well, look, there's a big difference between brand tracking and doing that initial deep dive when a new CMO comes in or there's a big interrogation of something. Tracking is just a repetitive measures, and there should be a relatively tight instrument at the heart of it, because we're not trying to diagnose now, we're just trying to understand, are we making progress? I don't know of any big brand that isn't tracking too much. There is no need, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, that you should have more than 20 variables in your tracker. Ideally, it should be closer to 10. Otherwise, it's a fishing expedition and it gets in the way. Another bugbear of mine are generic brand trackers. You've all got them and they're pointless. Let me be frank. The minute someone comes to you from a research company and wants 100, 200, 400 grand and says to you, the way brands are built is the following. Yeah. The minute they use the little b plural s, what that means is they don't understand brands at all. Every brand is different. It has a different positioning. It's aiming for differentiation. Therefore, measuring your brand versus other brands on the same metrics proves that these companies don't know what they're doing. There are some points of parity that need to be measured. NPS is a classic example. But there should be different variables in there, or there's something wrong with the tracker. I believe strongly in in-house brand tracking, something many of you do. I wouldn't be spending $1 externally, if I'm honest with you. I'd build the competency in-house, I'd save a fortune, I'd do a better job, I'd learn more. I would include the measures like NPS and the other funnel measures, as we've said, because obviously you need the funnel linked to the brand perceptions. And that's the secret for me of good tracking, is the combination of those two together that enable those correlations and correspondence analysis to take place. And that dancing back and forward is the heart of what should be a good brand tracker, an update on the funnel, and then the diagnostics that come out of the brand perceptions. Now, what do those brand perceptions look like? Well, obviously, I say obviously, but it doesn't happen that often. Whatever you've got in your brand positioning needs to be in your brand tracker, or there's no point having the brand tracker. Is my positioning getting across and into brand perceptions? There are also room, as we've said, for generic points of parity that should be included, but don't kill yourself. I've seen 20, 30, 40 variables being measured here. It's pointless. And finally, a true test of who is and isn't doing it properly, driven by qual research. A good brand tracker, half of the attributes are negative, yeah? Because it's as much about measuring the negatives as the positives. And yet again and again we see brand tracking that only focuses on positive attributes or low negative positive attributes. You're looking to measure negatives as well. They're a big part of this. Final point on this area is I don't think you should ever separate out attributes and associations. Again, most trackers I see in fin services have got, efficient, good value, etc. And then they've got trustworthy and stylish and associations in a different area. They're all just mental nodes. I would be focusing in on, irrespective of whether they're more rational or emotional or benefit based, just measuring them on suite and getting it down. But certainly for me, a good tracker, 30 questions done across the different segments is the way to play it. The minute you go past 30 questions and lose that elegance, I think it tells you something's wrong. All right. Woo, I went green. Sorry about that. Strategy and effectiveness drivers from the Incredible Hulk. Okay. I did a bit of research last year. The Effies in New York invited me to look at, it's 50 years last year of the Effies, and they invited me to look at all of their submissions. How about that? A lot of them were written on tatty pieces of toilet paper, so I couldn't do any analysis. But we dug out between 5,000 and 6,000 big brand submissions, stretching back about 20 odd years, that we could put into a giant database and do some analysis of to see what drives effectiveness, at least according to the Effies. And so I produced this top 10 list that I think is rather good. And I want to share with you that, and then we're going to delve into it, okay? Certainly very applicable to fin services. So at number 10, enough research. I found that doing too much research doesn't hurt you, but doesn't add any more benefit. But a bit of research, thankfully, does make your effectiveness better. A handful of objectives. Again, I was intrigued by this because I like to focus my clients on one or two. It turns out 3 or 4 shines through as the best way to do it. Obviously 7, 8, 9 strategic imperatives aren't strategic imperatives. It's just a shopping list. But the research does confirm the existing strategy literature. A handful, 3 or 4 main objectives is absolutely the way to go. Relative differentiation. If we had more time, I'd talk to you more about this. I don't believe you can own an attribute. I don't believe there's such a thing as a USP, but I still believe in differentiation. Relative to salience, relative to your competitors, so they have that association too, but even when you control for size of brand, you still see some relative performance on key associations from well-run brands. Yeah, and a key point, relative to the other positioning words. We tend to atomize things into these different attributes. I think good positioning is relative to the 2 or 3 things that load together in the mind of the customer. So yeah, a relative weaker version of differentiation, not as important as salience, but it still plays a role. And we shouldn't underestimate it. 7, multi-channel, mixing the tools up. Equal 5th, mass and targeted. I'll talk to you about this in a minute. I believe in both these days, and I want to go into why I do and how it applies to financial services. Linked to it is long and short, the Field and Burnett stuff. We'll talk about that too and why we're not doing it properly. Then the big ones, the top 4. ESOV, it's massively applicable to financial services. 3, codification, incredibly important. 2, creativity, I'll show you some data. And finally, disappointingly, brand size. Everyone sort of sighs when I get to this, when I present this data. But it turns out the number 1 driver of effectiveness, which is probably, I haven't got any numbers for this, but 5 to 10 times more important than creativity, is how big are you already? Yeah, good news for Commonwealth Bank. How big are you already? Not how much money you're spending and investing. That's a different thing. That's ESOV. The pure size of your existing network has created mental availability, physical availability, fame and heft. And as a result, every dollar you spend has a bigger return because you're already a bigger entity. Disappointing, isn't it? Because you always want to play the small against the big. Well, in capitalism, big beats small every day and twice at the weekend. Anyway, on a more uplifting note, creativity. I'm going to talk a lot about other things in this session, more about media and channels. But let's not forget that creativity sits at number 2 here as supremely important. And it's an important, thing to remember. If we look at the Nielsen data from a couple of years ago, Nielsen estimate that there's all these other non-creative factors like reach and recency and media context, but almost exactly 50% of effectiveness, according to Nielsen, comes from the quality of the creative that goes into the ad. Imagine that. And analytic partners have found a similar thing. As they look across the performance across different channels, The blue in these pie charts is the power just of the creative execution. The red is everything else. And again, we see that for TV and online video, 62%, 70% of impact just comes from, is your ad any good or not? And I know this sounds obvious, but we've forgotten that. And I'm not going to speak about it. But my point is, get a good agency and don't forget that 2/3 of your effectiveness, other than size, is probably coming from, is your ad any good? Don't just think about the pipe, worry about what you're stuffing into it. Number 3 was codification. You'll recognize my friends behind, I hope. Again, the reason codification is so important is because I call them codes, other people call them distinctive assets or brand assets. But looking like yourself, standing out, being seen and coming to mind quickly in your advertising, in your signage, in everything is so obvious. But because you work in a building with these colors, you forget how indistinct you are to the real target marketplace. And remember, there are 2 Ds in financial services. There is differentiation, but we spend too much time on it because it's not as, I believe it's important as I've said, but it's not as important as the other D, which is distinctiveness. Differentiation is how we're perceived versus the competition. What is our brand image? And we've all spent hundreds of hours looking at that. My point to you is distinctiveness. Does your bank come to mind? Does your insurance company pop into the head of the customer when they're cued by particular need states? And that's not about competition. That's about whether you're there, whether you're constantly there, whether you look like yourself, and whether you pop into mind. Again, I want to reinforce that idea. We're looking too much at positioning and differentiation. We're not looking enough in financial services at, am I there? Am I constantly looking like myself? And I love the work of Ipsos this year. They produced a new paper called The Power of You, where they did quite an advanced analysis of about 2,000 different campaigns, looking at what drives distinctiveness the most from the range of different code options that exist. So the data is pretty strong. It comes from America, but it's pretty strong. So what they found was, as you can see here, visual characters, fluid devices, as System 1 sometimes call them, the meerkats, yeah, or the Bank of Melbourne penguin, are by far the best performing. Yeah, I know they're a bit of a cliche, but they work. And they work by instantly making the customer realize which bank it is, and the linkage scores and therefore potential effect go through the roof. Then we go celebrities, and then we're on a slippery slope all the way down to logo at the bottom. But the big surprise, and you know, Amy is the only one I can think of in the insurance sector that uses this. I've always, I think unfairly, referred to people that they really bother me a lot about the power of audio branding. I refer to them as sonic loonies because they're so passionate about auditory branding. And I'm like, look, it's a sub area, right? It turns out the sonic loonies were right. Look at that. A sonic brand cue is the most effective of all, and is a far more impactful way of generating distinctiveness. So, for your consuming pleasure, are you distinctive enough? And if you're not distinctive enough, behold the answer. I want to speak about ESOV. It's a very important concept. It's one of the few laws. I don't believe in a lot of laws of marketing. Scientific marketing for me is not as clear as it is for certain others. But ESOV, excess share of voice, is one of the few rules which it's not just been proven. For 30 years, people have tried to disprove it and miserably failed. So we've really got to accept it. And it's hugely applicable to financial services in my experience too. So let me go through it. I know most of you know this. Excess share of voice. There has been since 1990 in John Peter Jones, there has been a strong, clear connection between share of voice in the category and your market share in that same category. An almost one-to-one relationship. There are little bends in it for small and big brands, but basically, if a brand has consistently had a share of voice of 10% in the category, all other things being equal, it will have about a 10% market share. There is an equilibrium here that plays out very nicely. And all we mean by excess share of voice is take the share of voice on the y-axis, subtract the share of market on the x, and you get a number. I mean, in this case, you get 0 because 10 minus 10 is 0. The point though about ESOV that makes it interesting is if a bank for whatever reason decides that it really wants to go for it and it ups its share of voice, let's say it doubles it in this case from 10% to 20% share of voice, and competitors don't notice or don't respond, then it will of course have achieved a positive ESOV, in this case plus 10, 20 minus 10. What's interesting about that is the equilibrium, if they continue to maintain this plus 10 ESOV, will eventually hold true. And at some point what we'll see is a, lo and behold, 20% market share. Now, the reverse also applies. Should a bank get lazy, should an insurance company sit on its laurels and its profits too much, and it decides, look, we've got a great market share, let's save some money on marketing, and they cut their share of voice, or competitors increase it, then we will again see eventually the equilibrium be restored. A minus 10 ESOV will result eventually in a market share correction. Why is this interesting? Many reasons. But one of them is the recession that we're about to go into thanks to our COVID-19 situation. As we enter this recession, something spectacular happens. And we've recorded this literally for 100 years. Many companies will go bust. Others will pull back on their marketing because they see the market shrinking, at least in the short term. When they do that, should you maintain your advertising spend, you may not be spending any more than you spent last year, but the relative share of voice will increase spectacularly, giving you a positive ESOV from the same amount of money. And the same rules of ESOV apply. As we come out of the recession, you will see yourself grow at a spectacularly faster rate than those that cut back. And this is the reason why recessions are such a fascinating time to build market share. Ask P&G about this. They've been doing it for a century. It's not because of the recession, it's because competitors pull back. Now, the question everybody asks, if you understand ESOV, is when does it happen? When do I get my money? Yeah. If I double my share of voice to 20% with an ESOV of plus 10, when will I get my extra 10% market share? Yeah. How long does it take? Well, the answer is about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on, no, it's not 2 to 3 weeks. If it was, we'd all be doing it. The answer is it depends. The best data, which comes from the IPA and the great statistician Peter Field, which again has been collected from hundreds of industries and hundreds of companies, is that if you achieve a plus 10% ESOV, you're likely on average, all other things like creativity and size being controlled for, to see a growth of market share of about 0.5 or 0.6 points per year. And in B2B, just slightly higher. But the good news is we have the data for financial services, and you guys are a much more elastic category. Should you get to a 10% ESOV, you will get a 1.5% market share boost for each year that you do it, all other things being equal. That's pretty attractive, I have to tell you. All right, why I want to dwell on these two together now, long and short and mass and targeted. Let's start with the long and short of it. For my money, the great theory of current marketing practice and immensely useful to financial services. So these two handsome fellas, you've probably seen them or even met them before. That's Peter Field and that's Les Binet. Not Binet, by the way, it's Binet. Don't ask him why. Okay. They were old when I was studying marketing, so it's fair to say they're very old now. Anyway, they've written a couple of books, the long and the short of it being the main one, but they've suddenly rose to fame because their time has come and their work is splendid and based on, again, hundreds and many years of analyses. This is evidence-based marketing at its very best. And they've become almost minor celebrities, much to their own embarrassment, which I find very amusing. Anyway, again, I'm sure you know this, but I'm going to cover it anyway, just so we're all up to speed. The long and the short of it centers on these two different axes to growth. All of you want that y-axis, sales uplift over base, otherwise known as growth, and it happens over time. Binet and Field have observed for many years two different avenues to growth. The first one I would call performance marketing. They call sales activation. But we know what that looks like, right? It's short-term, product-based, often digital investment, very targeted. But the main definition is, it could be a sales promotion. The main definition of performance marketing is I press the button of activation, spend money. When I do that, my sales go woo. The minute I take my foot off that button, the sales go woo, back down again. Okay? Nothing wrong with that, because the investment in the button gives us a significant return from the red curve. Yeah? Up and down, up and down, up and down. The second curve, the second trajectory of growth, is the long of it. It's slower. It's more incremental. It takes more time. How much time depends on the industry, but it's multi-year. Yeah? I always think of this axis as 3 or 4 years, for example. This is the blue line of brand building. Now remember, this is the long and the short of it. We're not saying, oh, blue's better than red. What we're saying is, if you were smart, you would combine the red of performance marketing and the blue of brand building together, because when you put them together, they produce a better return over this 3, 4, 5-year period than if you were to do either of them separately. Now, it's traditionally been referred to as the 60-40 rule because Field and Burnett have again observed that the magical best equilibrium is 60% long and 40% short. Now, that was based predominantly out of consumer goods, so more recently they've been challenged to look at other industries, and they've discovered there are slightly different ratios. The scary one for you, and I'm sure you already probably know this, is over there on the far left, is you're meant to put 80% of your total marketing budget into long-term brand building. Now that's scary because you're probably under immense pressure to do short-term product-based advertising for a variety of reasons we don't need to go into here. Let's be clear what this data says, and I do trust the data. It tells you that over a 4 or 5 year period, if you could get 70 or 80% of your money into brand building, you would make more money. Yeah, I believe that. I find that to be persuasive. Yeah, all other things being equal, and most of them are, you should have 78% of your budget in brand building and the rest in short-term performance-based activation. The key question, therefore, don't worry, it's not you. Nobody does that, okay? Don't panic. I mean, about 8 companies do it in the world. In financial services, I'd suggest none of them do it, which is bizarre, right? Because the data is pretty accurate and well collected. Why is there such a shortfall? I mean, the average in Australia, based on what I've seen, is about 70% short, 30% long, if you're lucky, right? So why have we got it literally the wrong way round? Well, the answer, and it took me a long time to work this out, is that we don't, I mean, if you look at this picture, what it tells you is the two together work and you make more money, but you don't see that, yeah? You don't see it on a PowerPoint chart presented in abstract. All of us, without exception, work on a 12-month planning cycle. And when you work on a 12-month planning cycle, this is what it looks like. Now, no one in their right mind is going to invest more in brand building than performance marketing, because performance marketing is going to give you a 2, 3, 4 times ROI versus brand building. And so what happens is everyone goes, oh, yeah, I can't prove it, and I don't know what's happening, and this is giving me a better ROI. ROI is a great variable for assessing performance marketing. It's hopeless at assessing brand building. You can't use it because the R is too short to measure the full value of the I. And so this, for me, explains a lot. We keep reliving the same year. We don't do it joined up. Again and again, we make the same mistake. Again and again, we look at ROI. And again, we put too much money into the short-term performance marketing and not enough into brand until next year when we make the same mistake again. Financial services marketing is, for want of a better metaphor, Groundhog Day. We keep getting up and making the same error. Or to use a more intellectual explanation, the great, I forgot his name now, I knew I was going to do this, Peter, oh gosh, I know his work really well, I swear. Bear with me while I do a very amateur moment. Drucker! I've got a mnemonic in my head, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, that I always forget his name for some reason. Anyway, the great Peter Drucker, probably the greatest thinker, even though I can never remember his surname. Peter Drucker, one of the many pearls of wisdom from him. You have to produce results in the short term, but you also have to produce results in the long term. Key point. And the long term is not simply the adding up of the short terms. I think we're lacking that long-term commitment to brand, and therein lies the problem. And if it's not Groundhog Day, to use one cliched 80s movie, In financial services, it's usually Ghost with Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze. Remembered his name all right. We start out usually with a great amount of gusto, going, yes, we believe in long and short. We want to do this. It sounds good. I've seen the wavy lines. We'll go 60, 70, 80% long. We will get very emotional. We'll get very ATL. We'll get very top of funnel, and we'll go for this. But in reality, within less than 12 months, what happens is nothing's happening. The numbers aren't changing. The C-suite's getting impatient that we're spending all this money on this stuff, not on the product-based stuff that brings in the money. Go short, go short, go short. My point to you is there's no point going long if you don't go long for the long term. And as obvious as that sounds, we're seeing this fallacy played out. I saw it at the moment with a client in America. They were all into it for a year, and now they're definitely not into it. And they think they've made the right choice, but they've missed what was about to happen. My experience, there are 3 CMOs that I get to work with. The first comes out of a big advertising agency, very talented, sorts out the brand, does some really good work, and really gets the long game working. But very quickly, she doesn't hit the numbers. She's got too much money committed to brand building. She's not delivering on the short term. The product people are getting scratchy, and she's fired within 18 to 24 months with nowhere to go. Next, we hire someone out of one of the tech companies, a proper digital marketer. Why not from Google? A really big name hire. They've got the short game sorted. They know what they're doing to start running very impressive performance marketing with even more impressive ROI numbers. After 2 years, however, it starts to slow down. There's no overhead bombing. There's no long-term brand building to feed the short term and make it work better. And within 36 months, he too has been fired. The queen or king of this story is the marketer that comes into a insurance company or bank and realizes, to begin with, I'm not going to get anyone to put 70 or 80% of the money into the long game. I might even be 80% short, right? But what I'm going to do is make that short work fast and make money quick. And maybe I've only got 20% for long-term brand building, but my goodness, I'll get the 20% and I'll have it for 3 or 4 years to make it work. And then something magical starts to happen. The short investments start generating a good ROI. And with that R, my CMO can start to invest a little bit more into long. Not into short, even though it's doing well, but carving a little bit off and putting more of it into long. The more she puts into long, into brand building, into mass marketing, into emotional advertising, into top of funnel work, the more it supports and energizes the short game. And that beautiful cycle starts to take place. And gradually over time, my CMO is able to cycle the money more and more into long to make the short work even better. And we get to that magical holy place that we so rarely reach, where the long and the short are working in tandem together. This is the CMO to watch out for. Now, one more point before we move on, which is super important. Now, I'm out on more of a limb here, but I want to make the point nonetheless. This is still being debated by various people, including Les and Pete. But here's my take on this is my idea, right? So it's probably wrong. We all struggle at the moment with targeting or not, right? We grew up STP, segment target position, but now there are more and more marketers out there, starting with P&G and the Dark Lord of penetration himself, Byron Sharp, saying mass marketing is the way to go. So what's the answer? I think the answer is twofold. If you look at the short of it in performance marketing, even looking at Les and Peter's own data, if you look at what has the biggest short-term activation effects, the biggest return for performance marketing, and you look at either existing customer segments, targeting new customers, or going after everyone in the category, existing customer segments still gives you the best return. We don't talk about that enough, yeah? But when it comes to brand building, when it comes to the long of it, there is a different pattern here. And if we look at annual market share growth, which is a better measure of the long of it, again, across existing customers, new customers, or mass marketing, going after everyone in the category, here we see a very different picture. And the picture says, as Professor Sharp predicted, targeting everyone does make more sense. Going after everyone in the category is the right approach. And so here we see, I think, a glimpse of an answer. In the short of it, we should still be targeting particular segments for activation. in the long of it, for the overall brand campaign, we should be hitting everyone in the category, which in financial services is pretty much everyone in the country. If you can hear my daughter, I'm terribly sorry. She's having an important moment in the next room, probably 2 rooms away, working from home. Multi-channel mix, and this will take me to my final section, which is maybe the most interesting. We'll see. So, backing up for a second, multi-channel mix takes us into tactics, and I have to spend a moment to talk about the late, great Don Schultz. So Don invented integrated marketing communications in the early 90s, and he sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was in his 80s. And Don really saw all of this long before Ubiquity and Analytic Partners, had the data to prove it. So, when I did my work on the Effies, I had to look at the optimum channel mix. I was very interested in this. We took about 5,000 campaigns, looked at how effective they'd been in terms of winning Effies and generating effectiveness, and looked at how many channels the campaigns used. And I genuinely didn't know the answer to the question, which was, what's the optimum number of channels to produce the ideal campaign? You'll hear different points of view. This is what the data from 5,000 campaigns told me. So what you're seeing here is the effectiveness score is going up as you add more channels. It's a very consistent pattern. And what it suggests is more is more. The more channels you add to a campaign, the more successful it is. And I'm not the first person to find this out. Analytic Partners looked at about 3,000 campaigns over a 5-year period and found a similar thing. They controlled for the budget, and they looked at, first of all, the 29% of campaigns that only used one channel. That could be digital video, it could be search, it could be TV or radio. When you add a second channel, any second channel, so it could be any 2 channels together, 31% of campaigns used 2 main channels, and when they looked at the average return, there was a leap of 19% over 1 channel. Now, add a third channel. Again, could be anything. It goes up by 23% over 1 channel. Now, add a 4th channel. It goes up by 31% over 1 channel. 5 channels, 35%. So it's the same message as my Effie research. More channels is actually a very good thing. Now, obviously, you could run out of budget eventually, but the point being here that more is more. There's probably an issue of unduplicated reach, and there's also that nice synergy that happens as different tools work together at different parts of the funnel. More is more. And we see it kind of in all the data. Analytic Partners have got other data showing that when you twin different channels together, starting OLV is annoying. It just means digital video, right? Online video, whatever. Digital video and TV together give you a massive optimization of an additional 35%. TV and search, outdoor and digital video. You see these synergies playing out together very nicely. And as you can see from many of these, it tends to be a focus on a traditional medium and a digital medium, although I know those 2 areas are a little bit grey. It comes back to what my formula has always been, and forgive me, it's brutally simple, but A times B is always greater than 2A or 2B when it comes to communications. A and B can be any 2 media you like. When you combine them together, they always give you a better impact than if you use one or the other. So this is typically how this plays out. And again, this is Analytic Partners data, looking at their famous ROI genome research, which has a huge database of campaigns and effectiveness measures, looking at what gives you the best short-term and long-term impact from different media channels. And what you see is this pattern of there's a certain sector in that top left light blue box that are the best long-term players, and then in that maroon box in the bottom right hand corner, the best short-term impact media. And you can probably guess what they were. Up in that top left corner we have the traditional channels: sponsorship, cinema, TV and outdoor. In the maroon channel we get digital display, social media and paid search. And that shouldn't probably surprise you, because over the last 10 years of a maturing digital media industry, we see the same picture, do we not? We see that the best long-term brand building tools tend to be the so-called traditional media. The old word for it was above the line. They were brand building. They were about effectiveness, the long of it, and typically focused on the top of funnel. Meantime, The bottom of the funnel was the digital media tools with their extra targeting capabilities and better ROI. The new version of below the line, performance marketing, all about efficiency, not effectiveness, and short activation. And that's kind of how we've stratified traditional and digital media so that both still coexist in most campaigns. We see it playing out also in other data. Now, this is interesting data. It comes from Analytic Partners, and it looks not only at financial services, but financial services in Australia. It doesn't get closer to home than that. And they've indexed everything to TV, because it's, you know, the main old channel, we should say. They've looked at how all the different channels perform for financial services, indexed against TV for short-term sales activation performance marketing. Here's what you see. First of all, TV remains the king, at least in short-term activation, versus the other media here, traditional media. But, again, no surprise, the digital media tend to outperform even TV when it comes to short-term activation. Now, you would imagine everyone's going to just move all of their money to digital, but of course you know what's going to come next. That's just the short of it. When we add the long of it to see what additional value in terms of long-term brand building the different media provide, we see a very different picture. Now we see a second complexity. We see, first of all, that these digital media, which were very good at short, are pretty crap at long. And the traditional media that had been pretty crap at short are delivering very nicely in terms of long-term brand building, far better than they have in terms of short-term activation. And there in the far left corner is TV. Look at that big whopping long-term brand building capability. TV still has that relatively predominant position for doing long-term brand building commitment. But as you know, and as I have become aware, we are entering the end of the stage of the big funnel of TV being uniformly effective. It doesn't mean TV's dead, but it does mean at some point we are entering, I'd say midpoint 2020s into 2030, a period where TV does begin to lose some of its ability for reach and therefore some of its impact too. We see that probably most notably with the ubiquity data. Now remember, this is me saying it, and I'm a big defender of TV, and it's ubiquity saying it with data, who are an even bigger defender of TV and have made it very clear in the past TV is not dying. Both of us have been saying this for 10 years. Nonetheless, we should look at ubiquity data because they are objective and it does paint a picture. So this is data which indexes the impact of television advertising back to 2010. Now 2010, you know, it's 10 years ago, believe it or not. It isn't that long ago is my point. So do you remember Rihanna and Eminem had Love the Way You Lie? I don't know if you remember that, but that was 2010's biggest hit. So it's not that long ago. Even I remember that, right? Here's what's happened since 2010 to the different demographic segments and the reach of TV advertising. So there we are at 2020, and there are now, I would argue, some pretty good projections of where things will land by 2025. You can see now there are two stories here. Sub 45, according to current age, there is a real issue now that is emerging, that we are seeing an existential crisis for TV as a medium to reach younger demographics. And I'm talking sub 40 now, which of course is the sweet spot in financial services for new recruitment. Above that 45 plus line, there is still a relative modicum of good news. You see it also playing out from Ubiquity's data when they look at where they estimate things will be just by 2022. So this is looking at 2018's numbers and where they will be in 2 more years' time versus 2018. I mean, 2018 we were only doing it literally a year ago in terms of executing the plan, right? So overall, the data they're using here is the impact of a 30-second TV ad. So what's the overall impact when you look at what you'd be paying and what it would do? Overall, TV advertising will decline 14%. But again, that older demo is actually going to respond more positively in the future. Then we see, a minus 20% drop off in 45 plus, which, believe it or not, isn't that bad. Where we're hemorrhaging impact for TV, no surprise, is in that 18 to 44-year-old group, which again, I would argue is the sweet spot for financial services. This is where we're recruiting. This is where everyone's going to get the next generation of customers. And that dark blue arrow suggests, we don't know this yet, that those behaviors may well continue into the 40s and 50s of the future generations. You could play this one either way. We don't know if today's 34-year-old will watch TV like a 55-year-old or like their 35-year-old self 20 years later. We simply don't know yet. But if that starts becoming a movable feast, there are major issues ahead. And again, I have to remind you that Ubiquity are straight players, straight up and down like 6 o'clock. And this is a quote that hit me very hard. Okay, at the end of the report, Mind the Gap, that they produced this year, they conclude, it is no longer possible to ignore what's happening to audiences in the TV marketplace. Subscription streaming services clearly pose an existential threat to the traditional broadcasting and advertising model we've known since the 1950s. It's an interesting statement, given that it comes from Ubiquity, not from Facebook or Google or anyone else, but from them. So the question is, how are we going to fill the gap? Because TV has been a huge part of financial services branding for 50 years. What are we going to do to fill that gap? And this is where I think things get intriguing. I wasn't quite honest with you earlier. So I showed you this sort of classic picture of the maroon digital tools and the light blue traditional tools, but I missed one out deliberately. There's another tool, according to the genome research from Analytic Partners, that doesn't fall into that pattern. And that tool is OLV, which is the annoying acronym for online video, or I'd prefer digital video. Yeah, digital video is an intriguing tool because it has both short and long-term capabilities, a very rare thing. And similarly, when we looked at this data earlier of long and short, I didn't pull out the one digital tool that can do both. There it is, digital video. Look at it. It's good short and it's good at long-term brand building. In fact, it's the best of all the digital tools at long-term branding. In fact, it's better than anything else other than TV. And so I believe that we reach a very important moment in the 20s. And I'm saying this not because I'm trying to sell digital video, but I believe this is the moment to start to talk about a sea change in how we think about marketing communication tactics. In the old world of the teenage decade, we talked about digital versus traditional, perhaps too much. I believe we now have to recognize that digital media cannot be left as a single catch-all term. I think we have to split it out, and we have to now acknowledge that digital video should sit separate from the other digital media tools because it offers something significantly different, not just in its short-term capabilities, but especially in its long-term potential brand building power. Now, before I go any further and get carried away with this, there are a couple of caveats to saying digital video is the future. First of all, I want to avoid those pendulum swings that say TV is dead, TV is over, nobody watches TV. I don't believe that. TV remains a very, very important medium for the foreseeable future. However, it's clear that in certain demographic groups, its power, its reach, and its value are diminishing so quickly, we must begin to change our mental models. Second, I personally don't believe we'll ever get it as good again. TV was expensive, but it was also good value, and it was possible to get 60, 70, 80% of the population of Australia to see your ads by broadcasting in certain time slots. That's probably never going to happen again, certainly not as easily as it once did back in the 70s and 80s. And finally, it's no good just saying, okay, do digital video along with your TV ads and it'll work to supplement them. Remember what we said at number 2 is creativity, and this certainly plays out in this digital space as well. You can't just take TV ads and stick them onto YouTube and expect to see the impact being matched. Again, the research from Analytic Partners is clear. when they measure the impact of taking your TV 30-second spot and sticking it into digital video, it's significantly less, yeah? A quarter almost of the response you get from creating custom-based, dedicated creative aimed at digital video itself, yeah? So you're not going to get any benefit, or you're going to get relatively little benefit by simply going, here's my TV ad, bang. You need a specialist approach, which we don't see that often in financial services either. Now, I'm going to go even further, and Google did not ask me to do this. I've done this purely based on my own reconnaissance and belief, okay? I think digital video, we also have to split into two categories as well. So just as I think we have to separate it from digital media, not all digital video is created equally. We must split that up into two further groups, to YouTube versus Facebook video. Why do I do that, and why do I say that? Because again, if you look at Ubiquity's latest data, it's clear that there are very big differences between these two forms of digital video. Now, if you look at reach, YouTube is a significant advantage over Facebook video in terms of how many people you can reach with your video. But that's not the really important story. The important story is, irrespective of how many people you reach, how many of them complete 50% of the ad, and then how many complete to the end? The answer is a gigantic differential. And so there's a clear difference in the quality of audience and impact that you're getting with YouTube versus Facebook video, which is also borne out, as you can see, from the 100% completion rate as well. Now, that's among the 16 to 24-year-olds. It's a similar pattern, though, among the 35 to 44-year-olds and the other demographic groups as well. Digital video is not the same as other digital tools, and within digital video, I would be separating out YouTube as a medium versus Facebook. But it is going to become an increasingly valuable tactic. And to see why, let's go back to the Ubiquity data. If you look at a more traditional demographic, the 65 plus is no surprise. Frankly, you'd want your head examined doing either Facebook or YouTube video, given what TV can do with a relatively simple weight and the reach it can achieve straight away. But the problem is the gap that's growing in those younger demographics. When we look at that through Ubiquity's data, what we see is that now YouTube is providing us with the predominant targeting tool, in this case for 16 to 24-year-olds. And that domination is likely to only increase as time goes on. And even in the 25 to 34-year-old category, we have to accept that Ubiquity data suggests that the reach now of YouTube is surpassing that of TV. So in summary, where do I get to in my little soiree that I then want to discuss with you later in the week? Here's what I'm suggesting. I think an ideal diagnosis should be tighter than what we're seeing at the moment and should consist of funnel and attribute data in a tight correlated mass. I think codes remain a very important part of this. I think most financial services brands have them, but may not be using them enough. Don't forget the power of creativity. It is still, next to brand size, the most important factor, something I can't talk to here, but want to remind you about. ESOV remains one of the great laws of marketing and is directly applicable to financial services. The long and the short is the great theory, and it's particularly, again, applicable, I think, to financial services. And it sits alongside mass and targeted. I believe the brands of the next 10 years will operate a two-speed brand plan, in which they'll go after the whole category with top-of-funnel brand building, and they'll have shorter, targeted, product-based campaigns aimed at specific target segments and probably utilizing more of those digital tools for the reasons we see here. Remember always that the optimum channel is none of the above, that diversity beats focus, and in many cases, the more tools, the better. There is a growing gap in TV's reach and therefore its effectiveness, which is particularly clear among younger demographics, and which Ubiquity predict will become a problematic issue in the middle part of this decade. I believe YouTube, and they don't pay me to say this, offers a superior alternative to Facebook in terms of the quality of eyeballs that it generates. I think digital video should not be classified with all the other digital tools, and I believe it is the best way that we can close, maybe not completely, the gap that is now emerging from the relative decline of TV among younger demographics. It's to digital video with all its brand building capabilities that I think we should turn our attention. Not by simply dumping TV ads into it, but treating it as an important medium. And frankly, given most financial services attention to younger sub 40-year-old demographics to recruit new customers, I believe it's probably going to become the predominant brand building tool as we go through this decade, and that we would expect financial services brands now to legitimately be moving more and more of their money from TV across to digital video and to YouTube in order to build brand to those younger demographics. So that's my spiel. I'll give you my references here. They're pretty common. If you want any of them, we can supply them. We've got the PDFs. We can do that after we have a discussion. I'm looking forward to discussing these concepts with you. It's something I personally enjoy. And I'm actually thankful Google has given me this chance. So I'm looking forward to catching up with you. I hope this was useful. Let's have a good chat later in the week and speak to you then. Ciao, ciao.